There we go, now I'm recording. This will be the next stream of Moby Dick. Let me change my Twitch header. There we go. I'm gonna lightly disguise the fact that I don't remember what stream number we're on by just saying, oh yeah, it's continuing. Alright. Enough joviality. Time to get into the serious business of reading. Oh, how's my audio, by the way? I have it, I have it set to, like, 400%, because I wasn't really happy with how it sounded. It's at, like, 16.9 decibels. Am I at a good, comfortable volume? Am I too loud? I doubt I'm still too quiet, but... because I just, I want to provide a good atmosphere, and I can't really do that if I can't be heard or if I'm destroying eardrums. Okay. You're a fan of the background. Ooh, I hate that. I hate that. I don't like that. I'll be right back. I gotta change that. If you can hear it, that makes me mad. I'll be right back. It's still, like I said before, it's still plenty cold. I don't need to have the fan on. Not yet, anyhow. And there will be plenty of time for me to sit with a fan. And I appreciate that, Corey. Alright. So... Let me get a refresher on what we were just what came before, so that I can give at least a little bit of a summary, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, so our main character Ishmael has met a rather unusual friend in the form of the man, Queequeg. They're very different people, but Ishmael has found a number of striking similarities at the core of one another's beliefs and general outlooks on life. And has sort of said, despite the really weird introduction that we had to one another where we were, sharing a bed, this Queequeg guy, he seems pretty alright. I like this guy. They have also, I believe, gained passage on a very particular boat. Let's see. Yeah. So they have... Oh, no, we have met Starbuck. Okay, thank goodness. I love Starbuck. They've gained passage on a ship captained by a mysterious man known only as Captain Ahab. But we have yet to actually meet Captain Ahab, so hopefully that'll happen soon. However, the most recent previous chapter saw Ishmael sort of making an argument for the idea that whaling shouldn't be considered as lowbrow a an occupation as it is. Now, obviously, in the modern day, we have a very different view on whaling. So, try to consider the perspective from how long ago? Let me see what the initial publishing date is. 1851. Yeah. Try to get yourself in the mindset of someone who's living in 1851 as opposed to 2023. Chapter 25. Postscript. In behalf of the dignity of whaling, I would fain advance naught but substantiated facts. But after embattling his facts, an advocate who should wholly suppress a not unreasonable surmise which might tell eloquently upon his cause, such an advocate, would he not be blameworthy? It is well known that at the coronation of kings and queens, even modern ones, a certain curious process of seasoning them for their functions is gone through. There is a salt cellar of state, so called, and there may be a caster of state. How they use the salt precisely, who knows? Certain I am, however, that a king's head is solemnly oiled at his coronation, even as a head of salad. Can it be, though, that they anoint it with a view of making its interior run well, as they anoint machinery? Much might be ruminated here concerning the essential dignity of this regal process, because in common life we esteem but meanly and contemptibly follow a fellow who anoints his hair, palpably smells of that anointing. In truth, a mature man who uses hair oil, unless medicinally, that man has probably got a quaggy spot in him somewhere. As a general rule, he can't amount to much in his totality. The only thing to be considered here is this: what kind of oil is used at coronations? Certainly it cannot be olive oil, nor Macassar oil, nor castor oil, nor bear's oil, nor train oil, nor cod liver oil. What then can it possibly be but the sperm oil in its unmanufactured, unpolluted state, the sweetest of all oils? Think of that, you loyal Britons. We whalemen supply your kings and queens with coronation stuff. Baby oil. Also, every guy who uses oil to slick back his hair was just roasted by Ishmael. Oh, excuse me. Chapter 26. Knights and Squires. Spitting facts. Knights and Squires. The chief mate of the Pequod was Starbuck, a native of Nantucket and a Quaker by descent. Exactly, Sari. He was a long, earnest man, and though born on an icy coast, seemed well adapted to endure hot latitudes, his flesh being hard as twice-baked biscuit. Transported to the Indies, his live blood would not spoil like bottled ale. He must have been born in some time of general drought and famine, or upon one of those fast days for which his state is famous. Only some 30 arid summers had he seen. Those summers had dried up all his physical superfluousness. But this, his thinness, so to speak, seemed no more the token of wasting anxieties and cares than it seemed the indication of any bodily blight. It was merely the condensation of the man. He was by no means ill-looking. Quite the contrary. His pure tight skin was an excellent fit, and closely wrapped up in it, and embalmed with inner health and strength, like a revivified Egyptian, this Starbuck seemed prepared to endure for long ages to come, and to endure always as now. For be it polar snow or torrid sun, like a patient chronometer, his interior vitality was warranted to do well in all climates. Looking into his eyes, he seemed to see there the yet lingering images of those thousand-fold perils he had calmly confronted through life. a staid, steadfast man whose life for the most part was a telling pantomime of action and not a tame chapter of sounds. Yet, for all his hearty sobriety and fortitude, there were certain qualities in him which at times affected, and in some cases seemed to weigh well nigh to overbalance all the rest. Uncommonly conscientious for a seaman, and endued with a deep natural reverence, the wild watery loneliness of his life did therefore strongly incline him to superstition. But to that sort of superstition which in some organization seems rather to spring somehow from intelligence than from ignorance. Outward portents and inward presentiments were his. And if, at times, these things bent the welded iron of his soul, much more did his faraway domestic memories of his young Cape wife and child tend to bend him still more from the original ruggedness of his nature, and open him still further to those latent influences which, in some honest-hearted men, restrain the gush of daredevil daring, so often evidenced by others in the more perilous vicissitudes of the fishery. I will have no man in my boat, said Starbuck, who is not afraid of a whale. By this he seemed to mean not only that the most reliable and useful courage was that which arises from the fair estimation of the encountered peril, but that an utterly fearless man is a far more dangerous comrade than a coward. Aye, aye, said Stubb, the second mate. Starbuck there is as careful a man as you'll find anywhere in this fishery. But we shall ere long see what that word careful precisely means when used by a man like Stubb, or almost any other whale hunter. Starbuck was no crusader after perils. In him courage was not a sentiment, but a thing simply useful to him, and always at hand upon all mortally practical occasions. Besides, he thought, perhaps that in this business of whaling, courage was one of the great staple outfits of the ship, like her beef and her bread, and not to be foolishly wasted. Wherefore he had no fancy for lowering for whales after sundown, nor for persisting in fighting a fish that too much persisted in fighting him. For, thought Starbuck, I am here in this critical ocean to kill whales for my living, and not to be killed by them for theirs. And that hundreds of men had been so killed, Starbuck well knew. What doom was his own father's? Where, in the bottomless deeps, could he find the torn limbs of his brother? With memories like these in him, and moreover given to a certain superstitiousness, as has been said, the courage of this Starbuck, which could nevertheless still flourish, must indeed have been extreme. But it was not in reasonable nature that a man so organized, and with such terrible experiences and remembrances as he had, it was not in nature that these things should fail in latently engendering an element in him which, under suitable circumstances, would break out from its confinement and burn all his courage up. And brave as he might be, it was that sort of bravery chiefly visible in some intrepid men, which, while generally abiding firm in the conflict with seas, or winds, or whales, or any of the ordinary irrational horrors of the world, yet cannot withstand those more terrific, because more spiritual terrors, which sometimes menace you from the concentrating brow of an enraged and mighty man. But were the coming narrative to reveal in any instance the complete abasement of poor Starbuck's fortitude, scarce might I have the heart to write it. But it is a thing most sorrowful, nay shocking, to expose the fall of valor in the soul. Men may seem detestable as joint stock companies and nations. Knaves, fools, and murderers there may be. Men may have mean and meager faces, but man in the ideal is so noble and so sparkling, such a grand and glowing creature, that over any ignominious blemish in him all his fellows should run to throw their costliest robes. That immaculate manliness we feel within ourselves, so far within us that it remains intact through all the outer characters seem gone, though all the outer characters seem gone, bleeds with keenest anguish at the undraped spectacle of a valor-ruined man. Nor can piety itself at such a shameful sight completely stifle her upbraidings against the permitting stars. But this august dignity I treat of is not the dignity of kings and robes, but that abounding dignity which has no robed investiture. Thou shalt see in shining in the arm that wields a pick, or drives a spike, that democratic dignity which on all hands radiates without end from God himself, the great God absolute, the center and circumference of all democracy, his omnipresence, our divine equality. I'm going to have to go get more water in a minute. If then to meanest mariners and renegades and castaways I shall hereafter ascribe high qualities, though dark, weave around them tragic graces, if even the most mournful, perchance the most abased, among them all, shall at times lift himself to the exalted mounts, if I shall touch that workman's arm with some ethereal light, if I shall spread a rainbow over his disastrous set of sun, then against all mortal critics bear me out in it, thou just spirit of equality, which has spread one royal mantle of humanity over all my kind. Bear me out in it, thou great democratic God, who didst not refuse to the swart convict Bunyan the pale poetic pearl. Thou didst clothe with doubly hammered leaves of finest gold the stumped and paupered arm of old Cervantes. Thou who didst pick up Andrew Jackson from the pebbles, who didst hurl him upon a war-horse, who didst thunder him higher than a throne, thou who in all thy mighty earthly marchings ever callest thy selectest champions from the kingly commoners, bear me out in it, O God. Stay hydrated. Don't worry, I will, believe me. I do plenty of water drinking these days. Chapter 27. Orville is really into Andrew Jackson. I think you mean Melville. No? Okay, fair enough. Chapter 27, Knights and Squires. Stubb was the second mate. He was a native of Cape Cod, and hence, according to local usage, what is called a Cape Cod man. A happy-go-lucky, neither craven nor valiant, taking perils as they came with an indifferent air, and while engaged in the most imminent crisis of the chase, toiling away, calm and collected as a journeyman joiner engaged for the year. Good-humored, easy, and careless, he presided over his whaleboat as if the most deadly encounter were but a dinner, and his crew all invited guests. He was as particular about the comfortable arrangements of his part of the boat as an old stage driver is about the snugness of his box. When close to the whale, in the very deathlock of the fight, he handled his unpitying lance coolly and offhandedly, as a whistling tinkerer his hammer. He would hum over his old rigadig tunes while flank and flank with the most exasperated monster. Long usage had, for this Stubb, converted the jaws of death into an easy chair. What he thought of death itself, there is no telling. Whether he ever thought of it at all might be a question, but if he ever did chance to cast his mind that way after a comfortable dinner, no doubt like a good sailor, he took it to be a sort of call of the watch to tumble aloft, and bestir themselves there, about something which he would find out when he obeyed the order, and not sooner. What, perhaps, with other things, made Stubbs such an easy-going, unfearing man, so cheerily trudging off with the burden of life in a world full of grave peddlers, all bowed to the ground with their packs, what helped to bring about that most impious good humor of his? That thing must have been his pipe. For, like his nose, his short black little pipe was one of the regular features of his face. You would almost as soon have expected him to turn out his bunk without his nose, as without his pipe. He kept a whole row of pipes there, ready loaded, stuck in a rack within easy reach of his hand, and whenever he turned in, he smoked them all out in succession, lighting one from the other to the end of the chapter, then loading them again to be readiness anew. For when Stubb dressed, instead of first putting his legs into his trousers, he put his pipe into his mouth. I say this continual smoking must have been one cause, at least of his peculiar disposition, for everyone knows that this early air, whether ashore or afloat, is terribly infected with the nameless miseries of the numberless mortals who have died exhaling it. And as in the time of cholera, some people go about with a camphor-ated handkerchief to their mouths. Or camphorated, I suppose. So, likewise, against all mortal tribulations, Stubb's tobacco smoke might have operated as a sort of disinfecting agent. The third mate was Flask, a native of Tisbury in Martha's Vineyard. A short, stout, ruddy young fellow, very pugnacious concerning whales, who somehow seemed to think that the great leviathans had personally and hereditarily affronted him, and therefore it was a sort of point of honor with him to destroy them whenever encountered. So utterly lost was he to all sense of reverence for the many marvels of their majestic bulk and mystic ways, and so dead to anything like an apprehension of any possible danger encountering them, that in his poor opinion the wondrous whale was but a species of magnified mouse, or at least water rat, requiring only a little circumvention and some small application of time and trouble in order to kill and boil. This ignorant, unconscious fearlessness of his made him a little waggish in the manner of whales. He followed these fish for the fun of it, and a 3 years' voyage round Cape Horn was only a jolly joke that lasted that length of time. As a carpenter's nails are divided into wrought nails and cut nails, so mankind may be similarly divided. Little Flask was one of the wrought ones, made to clinch tight and last long. They called him King Post on board of the Pequod, because in form he could be well likened to the short square timber known by that name in Arctic whalers, and which by the means of many radiating side timbers inserted into it serves to brace the ship against the icy concussions of those battering seas. Now these three mates, Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask, were momentous men. They it was who by universal prescription commanded 3 of the Pequod's boats as headsmen. In that grand order of battle in which Captain Ahab would probably marshal his forces to descend on the whales, these 3 headsmen were as captains of companies, or, being armed with their long, keen whaling spears, they were as a picked trio of lancers, even as the harpooners were flingers of javelins. And since in this famous fishery each mate or headsman, like a Gothic knight of old, is always accompanied by his boat steerer or harpooner, who in certain conjunctures provides him with a fresh lance, when the former one has been badly twisted or elbowed in the assault. And moreover, as there generally subsists between the two a close intimacy and friendliness, it is therefore but meet that in this place we set down who the Pequod's harpooners were, and to what headsman each of them belonged. First of all was Queequeg, whom Starbuck, the chief mate, had selected for his squire. But Queequeg is already known. Next was Tashtego, an unmixed Indian from Gayhead, the most westerly promontory of Martha's Vineyard, where there still exists the last remnant of a village of Redmen, which has long supplied the neighboring island of Nantucket with many of her most daring harpooners. In the fishery, they usually go by the generic name of Gayheaders. Tashtego's long, lean, sable hair, his high cheekbones, and black rounding eyes, for an Indian oriental in their largeness, but Antarctic in their glittering expression, all this sufficiently proclaimed him an inheritor of the unvitiated blood of those proud warrior hunters who, in quest of the great New England moose, had scoured, bow in hand, the aboriginal forests of the Main. But no longer snuffing in the trail of the wild beasts of the woodland, Tashtego now hunted in the wake of the great whales of the sea, the unerring harpoon of the sun, fitly replacing the infallible arrow of the sires. To look at the tawny brawn of his lithe, shaky limbs, you would almost have credited the superstitions of some of the earlier Puritans, and half believed this wild Indian to be a son of the prince of the powers of the air. Tashtego was Stubb the second mate's squire. So, I'm going to pause here and just reiterate that this book was written in 1851. And so there's going to be some language which I may not personally agree with. I respect the fact that the book was written in a much different time where the language was different in its connotation and denotation. So, yeah, we're gonna treat this as reading a historical text, because that's what it is, and I'm not gonna censor it unless we get into some really rough stuff. Third among the harpooners was Daggoo. I'm not terribly comfortable having a recording of myself saying this, so we're gonna skip a couple words here. Third among the harpooners was Daggoo, with a lion-like tread, an Osiris to behold. Suspended from his ears were two golden hoops, so large that the sailors called them ring-bolts, and would talk of securing the topsail halyards to them. In his youth, Daggoo had voluntarily shipped on board of a whaler, lying in a lonely bay on his native coast. Never having been anywhere in the world but in Africa, Nantucket, and the pagan harbors most frequented by the whalemen, and having now led for many years the bold life of the fishery in the ships of owners uncommonly heedful of what manner of men they shipped, Daggoo retained all his barbaric virtues, and, erect as a giraffe, moved about the decks in all the pomp of 6'5" in his socks. There was a corporeal humility in looking up at him, and a white man standing before him seemed a white flag come to beg truce of a fortress. Curious to tell, this imperial... It's not the word that you think it is, but it is a word that some people don't take kindly to at this point. So... I'll say African. Curious to tell, this imperial African, Osiris Daggoo, was the squire of Little Flask, who looked like a chessman beside him. As for the residue of the Pequod's company, be it said that at the present day not 1 in 2 of the many thousand men before the mast employed in the American whale fishery are Americans born, though pretty nearly all the officers are. Herein, it is the same with the American whale fishery as with the American army, and military, and merchant navies, and the engineering forces employed in the construction of the American canals and railroads. The same, I say, because in all these cases the Native American literally provides the brains, the rest of the world is generously supplying the muscles. No small number of these whaling seamen belong to the Azores, where the outward-bound Nantucket whalers frequently touch to augment their crews from the hardy peasants of those rocky shores. In like manner, the Greenland whalers sailing out of Hull or London put in at the Shetland Islands to receive the full complement of their crew. Upon the passage homewards, they drop them there again. How it is, there is no telling, but islanders seem to make the best whalemen. They were nearly all islanders on the Pequod. Isolados, too, I call such, not acknowledging the common continent of men, but each isolado living on a separate continent of his own. Yet now, federated along one keel, what a set these isolados were. An Anacharsis Klutz deputation from all the isles of the sea, and all the ends of the earth, accompanying old Ahab in the Pequod to lay the world's grievances before that bar, from which not very many of them ever come back. Black little Pip, he never did. Oh no, he went before. Poor Alabama boy. On the grim Pequod's forecastle ye shall ere long see him, beating his tambourine, elusive of the eternal time once sent for. To the great quarterdeck on high, he was bid strike in with angels, beat his tambourine in glory. Called a coward here, hailed a hero there. So, between chapters, because this next one has Ahab, I want to talk a little bit about what Herman Melville's goal with this book may have been. I don't mean to prescribe my own ideology and reading as the accurate and only correct interpretation of this book, but I think it's a pretty fair-handed one. So this is, in many ways, Melville's attempt to essentially paint a picture of humanity as being completely in unison and trying to, in pointing out the differences between people, point out the ridiculousness of putting too much weight into them. And I think that's really a very significant thing. I think that it's an ideology which is really commendable. Don't worry, Corey, the names will become easier to understand in time. Essentially, all you need right now are that the three mates are in order: Starbuck, then Stubb, then Flask. And their associates, the three men who were just covered, they'll become more important in a bit. I got you. When we get into the whaling chapters, it's totally fine. Even if you weren't on painkillers, I expect this kind of stuff would be tripping you up. It's complicated. It's very complicated. But yeah, so all I want to say on some of the pointing out the race stuff in this book is I think that Melville was trying to acknowledge differences in people in terms of culture and appearance and background and values without letting that cause them to be anything other than human, if that makes any sense. And like I said, I think that's a really commendable thing. There's a lot of writers throughout history who have not been quite so lofty with their goals. Quite frankly, off the top of my head, all I can really think of in terms of, at the very least, Western writers are Herman Melville and Walt Whitman. And yeah, I think that we can certainly make claims about the quality and validity of those attempts now, but at the same time, that's with 100 and no. Yeah, 100 and what is that? 80? Something like that. Years of difference. Yeah, Sari, that's absolutely perfect. It's exactly like that. It could be ridiculous from one person's point of view, but it could be perfectly sensible from another's, and it's hard to say who's truly right about that, because the goal here is so commendable and so vast in its desire that, like, just thinking about it kind of gets me emotional. Just trying to use an industry and a very small story, because, for the record, Herman Melville cared very deeply about the whaling industry, about whales, about all of it. Trying to use this as a sample platter, essentially, for humanity. And a lot of people call this book unfinished. People say that this book would be the greatest book ever written if it were finished. And I don't think it's possible with a goal like that. It's so mind-bogglingly large what you would try to do, that it's almost impossible to do completely. But I think I'm not normally one for participation awards, but I think that it's commendable that he tried. Anyhow, so that's my little disclaimer. The other half of that, of course, being, we have different language changes over time, and meanings change over time. As much as it frustrates me that happens, I like things to be the same. And so words that were respectful in one period of time are not considered respectful anymore. Other words come back around. And I can only hope that we will reach a point where fully and completely words can be considered within the context that they were meant to, and not be taken out of context. But until that day comes, I'm not going to intentionally put myself in a position where I'm going to be, set myself on fire, essentially. Anyhow. It's exciting time. Chapter 28, Ahab. For several days after leaving Nantucket, nothing above hatches was seen of Captain Ahab. The mates regularly relieved each other of the watches, and for aught that could be seen to the contrary, they seemed to be the only commanders of the ship. Thank you, Chris. That's a wonderful first comment in my chat. I really appreciate it. I could set myself on fire, metaphorically. I could do that, but that's a discussion for another time. Or I could set myself on fire literally, but that's another discussion for another time. Mates regularly relieve themselves of each other. Only sometimes issued from the captain with cabin with orders so sudden, peremptory, that after all, it was plain they but commanded vicariously. Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it. Don't worry, Corey. I won't set myself on fire literally. Yet. Alright. Yet their supreme lord and dictator was there, though hitherto unseen by any eyes not permitted to penetrate into the now sacred retreat of the cabin. Every time I ascended to the deck from my watches below, I instantly gazed aft to mark if any strange face was visible. For my first vague disquietude touching the unknown captain, now in the seclusion of the sea, became almost a perturbation. This was strangely heightened at times by the ragged Elijah's diabolical incoherences uninvitedly recurring to me with a subtle energy I could not have before conceived of. For reference here, Elijah was somebody that Ishmael met on shore before joining the Pequod's crew, who gave some, let's say, vague warnings about the quality of Ahab's character and also the sanity of his, which is to say not a lot. Gremlin. Listen, I mean, you've seen the picture. You've seen the picture of me doing that pose. Vague warnings, those are always super helpful. Yeah, what do they call it in the horror movies? Harbinger. He was the harbinger of this story. He was the one to say, "Oh, don't people go to that cabin and they don't always come back." If you've seen Cabin in the Woods, you know what I'm talking about. Anyways, just going back to the sentence to put us back in context. This was strangely heightened at times by the ragged Elijah's diabolical incoherences, uninvitedly recurring to me with a subtle energy I could not have before conceived of. But poorly could I withstand them, much as in other moods I was almost ready to smile at the solemn whimsicalities of that outlandish prophet of the wharves. But whatever it was of apprehensiveness or uneasiness, to call it so, which I felt, yet whenever I came to look about me in the ship, it seemed against all warranty to cherish such emotions. For though the harpooners, with the great body of the crew, were a far more barbaric, heathenish, and motley set than any of the tame merchant ship companies with which my previous experiences had me acquainted with, still I ascribed this, and rightly ascribed it, to the fierce uniqueness of the very nature of that wild Scandinavian vocation in which I had so abandonedly embarked. But it was especially the aspect of the three chief officers of the ship, the mates, which was most forcibly calculated to allay these colorless misgivings and induce confidence and cheerfulness in every presentment of the voyage. Three better, more likely sea officers and men, each in his own way, could not readily be found, and they were every one of them Americans, a Nantucketer, a Vineyarder, a Capeman. Now, it being Christmas when the ship shot from out her harbor, that's weird phrasing, but that's okay because it's old. Now it being Christmas when the ship shot from out her harbor, for a space we had biting polar weather, though all the time running away from it to the southward, and by every degree and minute of latitude which we sailed, gradually leaving that merciless winter and all its intolerable weather behind us. God, what I would give for that weather right now. It was one of those less lowering, but still gray and gloomy enough, or I guess lowering, but still gray and gloomy enough mornings of the transition, when with a fair wind the ship was rushing through the water with a vindictive sort of leaping and melancholy rapidity, that as I mounted to the deck at the call of the forenoon watch, so soon as I leveled my glance toward the taffrail, foreboding shivers ran over me. Reality outran apprehension. Captain Ahab stood upon his quarterdeck. There seemed no sign of common bodily illness about him, nor of the recovery from any. He looked like a man cut away from the stake, and the fire has overrunningly wasted all the limbs without consuming them, or taking away one particle from their compacted, aged robustness. His whole high, broad form seemed made of solid bronze, and shaped in an unalterable mold, like Cellini's cast Perseus. Threading its way out from among his gray hairs, and continuing right down one side of his tawny, scorched face and neck till it disappeared in his clothing, he saw a slender, rod-like mark, lividly whitish. It resembled that perpendicular seam sometimes made in the straight, lofty trunk of a great tree, when the upper lightning tearingly darts down it, and without wrenching a single twig, peels and grooves out the bark from top to bottom, ere running off into the soil, leaving the tree still greenly alive, but branded. Whether that mark was born with him, or whether it was the scar left by some desperate wound, no one could certainly say. By some tacit consent, throughout the voyage little or no allusion was made to it, especially by the mates. But once Tashtiga Sr., an old gay-head Indian among the crew, superstitiously asserted that not till he was full 40 years old did Ahab become that way branded. And then it came upon him, not in the fury of any mortal fray, but in an elemental strife at sea. Yet this wild hint seemed inferentially negatived by what a grey Manxman insinuated, an old sepulchral man, who, having never before sailed out of Nantucket, had never ere this laid eye upon wild Ahab. Nevertheless, old sea traditions, the immemorial credulities, popularly invested this old Manxman with preternatural powers of discernment, so that no white sailor seriously contradicted him when he said that if ever Captain Ahab should be tranquilly laid out, which might hardly come to pass, so he muttered, then whoever should do that last office for the dead would find a birthmark on him from crown to sole. So powerfully did the whole grim aspect of Ahab affect me, and the livid brand which streaked it, that for the first few moments I hardly noted that not a little of this overbearing grimness was owing to the barbaric white leg upon which he partly stood. It had previously come to me that this ivory leg had at sea been fashioned from the polished bone of the sperm whale's jaw. Aye, he was dismasted off Japan, said the old gay-head Indian once. But like his dismasted craft, he shipped another mast without coming home for it. He has a quiver of them. I was struck with the singular posture he maintained. Upon each side of the Pequod's quarterdeck, and pretty close to the mizzen shrouds, there was an auger hole, bored about half an inch or so into the plank. His bone legs steadied in that hole, one arm elevated, and holding by a shroud, Captain Ahab stood erect, looking straight out beyond the ship's ever-pitching prow. There was an infinity of firmest fortitude, a determinate, unsurrenderable willfulness, in the fixed and fearless forward dedication of that glance. Not a word he spoke, nor did his officers say aught to him, though by all their minutest gestures and expressions they plainly showed the uneasy, if not painful, consciousness of being under a troubled master eye. And not only that, but moody, stricken Ahab stood before them with a crucifixion in his face, in all the nameless, regal, overbearing dignity of some mighty woe. Ere long, from his first visit in the air, he withdrew into his cabin, but after that morning he was every day visible to the crew, either standing in his pivot hole, or seated upon an ivory stool he had, or heavily walking the deck. As the sky grew less gloomy, indeed began to grow a little genial, he became still less and less a recluse, as if, when the ship had sailed from home, nothing but the dead wintry bleakness of the sea had then kept him so secluded. And by it came to pass that he was almost continually in the air, but as yet, for all that he said, or perceptibly did, on the at last sunny deck, He seemed as unnecessary there as another mast. But the Pequod was only making a passage now, not regularly cruising. Nearly all whaling preparatives needed supervision. Nearly all whaling preparatives needing supervision, the mates were fully competent to, so that there was little or nothing out of himself to employ or excite Ahab now, and thus chase away for that one interval the clouds that layer upon layer were piled upon his brow, as ever all clouds choose the loftiest peaks to pile themselves upon. Nevertheless, ere long, the warm, warbling persuasiveness of the pleasant holiday weather we came to seemed to gradually charm him from his mood. For as when the red-cheeked dancing girls April and May trip home to the wintry, misanthropic woods, even the barest, ruggedest, most thunder-cloven old oak will at least send forth some green sprouts to welcome such glad-hearted visitants. So Ahab did, in the end, a little respond to the playful allurings of that girlish air. More than once did he put forth the faint blossom of a look which, in any other man, would have soon flowered out in a smile. So that's our introduction to Ahab. 28 chapters in, and one of the most famous characters in all of Western literature finally shows up. And it's just a chapter dedicated to describing him. It's a hell of an entrance. So, something at this point that I'd like to bring up is that when this book was first discussed in the class where I was introduced to it, or it was introduced to me, or however you want to phrase it, there was a suggestion made of the idea that, and Sari in particular, I think you'll find this interesting, Ahab is both an acknowledgement of and a rebuttal against the classical romantic hero. And what that means is a romantic hero is not like the hero of a romance novel, though I'm sure that there are plenty of situations where that Venn diagram does have some intersection. A romantic hero would be the hero of a piece of literature from the Romantic period, which, if memory serves, was generally about the idea of humanity being capable of bending even nature to their whim, and being sort of as powerful as nature themselves, if not more so. And it's something to consider with Ahab, is this man who is associated over and over and over again with storms and the sea and weather and all of this stuff. It's an interesting way of framing this character, because he could just as easily be seen by a different character in a completely different light. Anyhow, now that Ahab's been introduced, I'm gonna go get some more water. Oh, what'd you say? He's one of them. Physical. Yeah. I think the next chapter has his first actual spoken lines. I don't remember exactly what they are, but I remember them being interdasting. And yeah, he's not fully human, if you want to look at it that way. He's already part nature, but it's not in a way where he's part of nature. He's been damaged by nature, and he's damaged nature in return, and he's spliced some of its power into his. So he's a very interesting character, and what he stands for and what he represents are very intriguing concepts. And this is why I love the book so much. Is there's so many layers and so many potential ways of viewing it. It's just fascinating. He's very intense, and that will be shown more. Yeah, so I am going to take a quick break just to get myself some more water, rest my voice for a few minutes, and I will be back shortly. Okay, I am back. And I appreciate that very much, Corey. Thank you. I'm horribly out of practice. Several years out of practice, in fact. Because most of what I've read recently, in terms of academic stuff, has been painfully academic and essentially exclusively academic. And it's been like a year or so since I've done even that. So, fun aside, Sari. I constantly get Tennyson and Byron mixed up in my head because they're both lords. And that's it. That's the only reason. So every so often I gotta remind myself of who's who. It's ridiculous. Oh, thank you, Corey. Let's see. That would have been funny, sorry. Let's see, how long have I been going for? An hour? Okay. Ooh, that's cute. I like that. It is probably going to start heating up here at around 11:30. Like, I can already feel it warming up a little bit. If I had a functioning AC, I'd go for a lot longer. But yeah, I can definitely do a couple of these next chapters. No problem, because they're all really short. Let me see. Oh boy. Oh boy, we're gonna hit one of the whale chapters soon. Are you excited? Sari knows what I'm talking about, but, oh dear. Alright, chapter 29. Enter Ahab. To him, Stub. Some days elapsed. Sorry, I thought I mispronounced that and I got it wrong. Warming up at 11:30. Yes, I did, Farah. It is not yet noon. Oh man, listen. I'm gonna be up and active and doing things regardless. It's just that I'm in a room with especially poor air circulation, so I'm going to be excuse me. I'm going to be moving out of here after I'm done. Moving into a different room, just because it gets hot. You know how it is. Anyways, chapter 29. Enter Ahab. To him, Stub. Some days elapsed, and ice and icebergs all astern. The Pequod now went rolling through the bright Quito spring, which at sea almost perpetually reigns on the threshold of the eternal August of the tropic. The warmly cool, clear, ringing, perfumed, overflowing, redundant days were as crystal goblets of Persian sherbet, heaped up, flanked up with rosewater snow. The starred and stately night seemed haughty dames in jeweled velvets, nursing at home in lonely pride the memory of their absent conquering earls, the golden-helmeted sons. For sleeping man, 'twas hard to choose between such winsome days and such seducing nights. But all the witcheries of that unwaning weather did not merely lend new spells and potencies to the outward world. Inward they turned, upon the soul, especially when the still mild hours of eve came on. Then memory shot her crystals as the clear ice most forms of noiseless twilights. And all these subtle agencies, more and more, they wrought on Ahab's texture. Oh, Farah, you're so lucky. We're going to be seeing, I did the math earlier. Today, it's going to be about 36 Celsius at its peak, which is coming soon. It sucks. Old age is always wakeful, as if the longer linked with life, the less man has to do with aught that looks like death. Among sea commanders, the old greybeards will oftenest leave their berths to visit the night-cloaked deck. It was so with Ahab, only that now, of late, he seemed so much to live in the open air that, truly speaking, his visits were more to the cabin than from the cabin to the planks. "It feels like going into one's tomb," he would murmur to himself, "for an old captain like me to be descending this narrow scuttle, to go to my grave-dug berth." So, almost every 24 hours, when the watches of the night were set, and the band on deck sentineled the slumbers of the band below, and when, if a rope was to be hauled upon the forecastle, the sailors flung it not rudely down, as by day, but with some cautiousness dropped it to its place for fear of disturbing their slumbering shipmates. When this sort of steady quietude would begin to prevail, habitually the silent steersman would watch the cabin scuttle, and ere long the old man would emerge, gripping at the iron banister to help his crippled way. Some considering touch of humanity was in him, for at times like these he usually abstained from patrolling the quarterdeck, because to his wearied mates, seeking repose within 6 inches of his ivory heel, such would have been the reverberating crack and din of that bony step that their dreams would have been on the crunching teeth of sharks. But once the mood was on him too deep for common regardings, and as with heavy lumber-like pace he was measuring the ship from taffrail to mainmast, Stubb, the old second mate, came up from below with a certain unassured, depreciating humorousness. Hinted that if Captain Ahab was pleased to walk the planks, then no one could say nay. But there might be some way of muffling the noise, hinting something indistinctly and hesitantly about a globe of tow and the insertion into it of the ivory heel. Stubb, thou didst not know Ahab then. Am I a cannonball, Stubb, said Ahab, that thou wouldst wad me that fashion? But go thy ways, I had forgot. Below to thy nightly grave, where such as ye sleep between shrouds, to use ye to the filling one at last. Down, dog, and kennel. Starting at the unforeseen concluding exclamation of the so suddenly scornful old man, Stubb was speechless for a moment, and said excitedly, I am not used to be spoken to that way, sir, but I do but less than half like it, sir. Avast, gritted Ahab between his teeth, and violently moving away as if to avoid some passionate temptation. No, sir, not yet, said Stubb, emboldened. I will not tamely be called a dog, sir. Then be called 10 times a donkey and a mule and an ass, and be gone, or I'll clear the world of thee. As he said this, Ahab advanced upon him with such overbearing terrors in his aspect that Stubb involuntarily retreated. I was never served so before without giving a hard blow for it, muttered Stubb as he found himself descending the cabin scuttle. It's very queer. Stop, Stubb. Somehow now, I don't well know whether to go back and strike him or... What's that? Down here on my knees and pray for him. Yes, that's the thought. That was the thought coming up in me, but it would be the first time I ever did pray. It's queer, very queer, and he's queer too. I take him fore and aft, he's about the queerest old man Stubb ever sailed with. How he flashed at me, his eyes like powder pans. Is he mad? Anyway, there's something on his mind. As sure as there must be something on a deck when it cracks. He ain't in his bed now, either, more than 3 hours out of the 24, and he don't sleep then. Didn't that doughboy, the steward, tell me that of a morning he always finds the old man's hammock clothes all rumpled and tumbled, and the sheets down at the foot, and the coverlid almost tied into knots, and the pillow sort of frightful hot, as though a baked brick had been on it? A hot old man. Guess he's got what some folks ashore call a conscience. It's kind of a tick-dolly row, they say. Worse nor a toothache. Well, I don't know what it is, but the Lord keep me from catching it. He's full of riddles. Wonder what he goes into the afterhold for every night, as Doughboy tells me he suspects. What's that for, I should like to know? Who's made appointments with him in the hold? Ain't that queer now? There's no telling. It's the old game. Here goes first news. Damn me, it's worth a fellow's while to be born into the world, if only to fall right asleep. Now that I think of it, it's about the first thing babies do, and that's sort of queer too. Damn me, but all things are queer, come to think of them. That's against my principles. Think not is my 11th commandment, and sleep when you can is my 12th. So here goes again. But how's that? Didn't he call me a dog? Blazes, he calls me 10 times a donkey and piled a lot of jackasses on top of that. Might as well have kicked me and done with me. Maybe he did kick me and I didn't observe it. I was so taken aback with his brow, somehow. It flashed like a bleached bone. What the devil's the matter with me? I don't stand right on my legs. Coming afoul of that old man has a sort of turned me wrong side out. By the Lord, I must have been dreaming, though. How? The only way is to stash it. So here goes to hammock again, and in the morning I'll see how this plaguey juggling thinks over by daylight. So, for the record, that is a chapter where most of it is just Stubb reeling after being insulted by Ahab. If you heard me read that and were like, is there something more that I'm missing? Nope, that's it. Yep, that's exactly right, Sari. That is who he is. See, I know what's coming. I know what's going to happen. So I get enjoyment out of the whole experience. But initially with Ahab, I was like, man, what a jerk. Which, is also not inaccurate. Chapter 30. The Pipe. When Stubb had departed, Ahab stood for a while, leaning over the bulwarks. And then, as had been usual with him of late, calling a sailor of the watch, he sent him below for his ivory stool, and also his pipe. Lighting the pipe at the binnacle lamp and planting the stool on the weather side of the deck, he sat and smoked. In old Norse times, the thrones of the sea-loving Danish kings were fabricated, saith tradition, of the tusks of the narwhal. How could one look at Ahab, then, seated on that tripod of bones, without bethinking him of the royalty it symbolized? For a Khan of the plank, and a king of the sea, and a great lord of leviathans, was Ahab. Some moments passed, during which the thick vapor came from his mouth in quick and constant puffs, which blew back again into his face. "How now?" he soliloquized at last, withdrawing the tube. "This smoking no longer soothes. Oh, my pipe, hard must it go with me if thy charm be gone. Here have I been unconsciously toiling, not pleasuring, aye, and ignorantly smoking to windward all the while. To windward, and with such nervous whiffs as if, like the dying whale, my final jets were the strongest and fullest of trouble. What business have I with this pipe? This thing that is meant for sereneness, to send up mild white vapors among mild white hairs, not among torn iron grey locks like mine. I'll smoke no more." He tossed the still-lighted pipe into the sea. The fire hissed in the waves, the same instant the ship shot by the bubble the sinking pipe made. With slouched hat, Ahab lurchingly paced the planks. So, a lot of people get different things out of that chapter. Some people see that as the moment that Ahab seals his fate, actually. Others see it as a sign of things to come. Some people just see it as Ahab, a demonstration of where Ahab's mind is at, and not a lot more. Ahab is an emo. That's a legitimately complicated question, Farah. Ahab is the culmination of pro- and anti-romantic literary sensibilities come together in a single person. He is very conflicted, and he doesn't really let other people see that about him, but it's there, and it shows up in his most solitary moments. So if you want to call that emo, go for it, absolutely, and I won't knock you for it in the slightest. It's very, very ridiculous to throw your pipe into the ocean instead of just locking it away. It's extra, is what it is. Had to search for that, but it's what the kids call extra these days. He's very dramatic. And part of what makes this book so funny to me is that you can have these chapters where, and as this goes on, this will be a lot more common, Ahab has these roiling, fury-filled monologues and soliloquies, and they're immediately followed up by the most mundane, boring chapters about the specific types of whale and how you can tell how they're different, and it's amazing. A lot of people get different things out of this book, and to my mind, I get a lot of comedy, like a lot of comedy. This is to me one of the greatest black comedies ever made. It's just fascinating. Because the whale chapters are so boring. But that's the whole point. They're like telling you about whale. Well, you'll see. You'll get it. You'll understand. In the meantime, Chapter 31, Queen Mab. Next morning, Stubb accosted Flask. Such a queer dream, King Post, I never had. You know the old man's ivory leg? Well, I dreamed he kicked me with it. And when I tried to kick it back, upon my soul, my little man, I kicked my leg right off. And then presto, Ahab seemed a pyramid, and I, like a blazing fool, kept kicking at it. But what was still more curious, Flask, you know how curious all dreams are, through all this rage that I was in, I somehow seemed to be thinking to myself that after all, it was not much of an insult, that kick from Ahab. Why, thinks I, what's the row? It's not a real leg, only a false one. There's a mighty difference between a living thump and a dead thump. That's what makes a blow from the hand, Flask, 50 times more savage to bear than a blow from a cane. The living member, that makes the living insult, my little man. And thinks I to myself all the while, mind, while I was stubbing my silly toes against that cursed pyramid, so confoundedly contradictory was it all the while, I say, while I was thinking to myself, what's his leg now but a cane, a whalebone cane? Yes, thinks I, it was only a playful cudgeling. In fact, only a whaleboning that he gave me. Not a base kick. Besides, thinks I, look at it once. Why, the end of it, the foot part. What a small sort of end it is. Whereas if a broad-footed farmer kicked me, there's a devilish broad insult. But this insult is whittled down to a point only. And now comes the greatest joke of the dream, Flask. While I was battering away at the pyramid, a sort of badger-haired old merman with a hump on his back takes me by the shoulders and slews me round. What are you about? Says he. Slid. Man, but I was frightened. Such a fizz. But somehow, next moment, I was over the fright. What am I about? Says I at last. What business is that of yours, I should like to know, Mr. Humpback? Do you want a kick? By the Lord, Flask, I had no sooner said that than he turned round his stern to me, bent over, and dragging up a lot of seaweed he had for a clout. What do you think I saw? Why, thunder alive, man, his stern was stuck full of marlin spikes, with the points out. Says I on second thought, I guess I won't kick you, old fellow. Why, Stubb, said he, why, Stubb, and kept muttering it all the time, sort of eating of his gums like a chimney hag. Seeing he wasn't going to stop saying over his why, Stubb, I thought I might as well fall to kicking the pyramid again. But I had only just lifted my foot for it when he roared out, Stop that kicking! Halloa, says I, what's the matter now, old fellow? Look ye here, says he, let's argue the insult. Captain Ahab kicked you, didn't he? Yes, he did, says I. Right here it was. Very good, says he. Used his ivory leg, didn't he? Yes, he did, says I. Well then, says he. Why, Stubb, what have you to complain of? Didn't he kick with... Right good will? It wasn't a common pitch pine leg you kicked with, was it? No, you were kicked by a great man with a beautiful ivory leg, Stubb. It's an honor. I consider it an honor. Listen, wise Stubb. In old England, the greatest lords think it great glory to be slapped by a queen, and made garter knights of. But be your boast, Stubb, that you were kicked by old Ahab, and made a wise man of. Remember what I say, be kicked by him. Account his kicks honors, and on no account kick back, for you can't help yourself, wise Stubb. Don't you see that pyramid? With that, he all of a sudden seemed somehow in some queer fashion to swim off into the air. I snored, rolled over, and there I was in my hammock. Now, what do you think of that dream, Flask? I don't know. Seems a sort of foolish to me, though. Maybe. But it's made a wise man of me, Flask. Do you see Ahab standing there, sideways looking over the stern? Well, the best thing you can do, Flask, is to let the old man alone. Never speak to him, whatever he says. Halloa, what's that he shouts? Hark. Masthead there. Look sharp, all of you. There are whales hereabouts. If you see a white one, split your lungs for 'em. What do you think of that now, Flask? Ain't there a small drop of something queer about that, eh? A white whale. Did you mark that, man? Look ya, there's something special in the wind. Stand by for it, Flask. Ahab has that bloody things... that's bloody on his mind. But Mum, he comes this way. So, like I said, there's some weird humor in this. Okay. Let's see, how long have I been going? An hour 30-ish. So the next chapter is the first whale chapter, which is quite literally just a collection of different types of whales. And it is 12 pages long, which doesn't sound that bad, but it is. Trust me. My throat's actually starting to hurt a little bit, so I'm going to have to call it here for now. I would have liked to continue on, but yeah, I don't know. There's just my throat's starting to hurt a little bit. I appreciate literary dreams that are genuinely nonsensical. The temptation to make them line up perfectly with the plot is intense. Yeah, I agree. It's so nice to have a dream in a book where the whole point is how do you get this character from wanting to fight Ahab the night prior to not wanting to fight Ahab the next day. And it's just a weird dream. I love it. It's so good. Ahab turning into a pyramid and all that. Anyhow, I am not going to be able to do this tomorrow, but I believe I will have some time on Wednesday, so maybe you'll see me there. You should see me there, I should say. I may not do another reading stream. I may just play some games. We'll see. But either way, thanks for coming. It also makes a lot of sense. Dreams are weird. Yeah, I mean, you know, dreams are strange. I had a dream that it just disappeared immediately. Well, I guess a good point to the fact that I had a dream at one point that everybody in the Sulfurd server called me Crobler instead of Creon. Usually available at the moment unless I got physical therapy, but if I can, I'll definitely be there. Absolutely. You know, I'll let you know beforehand when I'm going live. I'll try to make announcements about it and stuff. I'm sorry that your knee is not doing well, Corey. But at the very least, I hope it's doing a little better than it was. Yeah, like I said, thanks everybody for coming. Let me see how many people we've got in chat. Wow, we've got a lot of people in chat, it seems like. Oh my goodness. Thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Let me see who's live right now. See if there's somebody that I like that I could host. Wow. Nope. Everybody that I follow is offline right now. Okay. Let's see. I wonder if oh, you know what? That's strange. OBS is telling me that there are a lot more viewers than Twitch is saying. I don't know who's accurate. No. Yeah, it says there's a lot of people in chat. Well, you know, I thank all people who came. I appreciate it immensely. I truly do. I read a lot of books. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, let me see if there's somebody I could host. Hold on. Nope. Nobody else is doing anything Moby Dick related, so that's okay. Yeah, all right. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for being here. Bye.